Chess friends, I hope you are doing well. Humans always hope. I don't hope, I evaluate. While you check your mood, I already checkmate you. Today, AlphaZero will play against Magnus Carlsen. Man versus machine. Mozart of chess versus the silicon god. Spoiler, Mozart's piano can't beat a supercomputer. And this game is very amazing because he sacrificed his rook. You call it sacrifice. Alpha calls it long-term investment. Humans eat oatmeal for breakfast, Magnus plays d4. Both planned, both cautious. Alpha played knight to f6 going into the Indian game where e6, d5, g6, and d6 can be played in future variations. Nf6, the Indian game. For humans, a jungle. For Alpha, a solved equation. Future variations. Already history in my memory. Therefore, Magnus goes with the c4 line. Magnus pushes, c4, trying to claim space. But claiming space against Alpha is like drawing borders on the ocean. We have e6 where d5 can be deployed. You say deployed like it's a military mission. For Alpha, e6 d5 is not deployment, it's gravity, automatic. Magnus chose to consider knight f3. He could have gone with knight c3 or bishop to g5. Ah yes, humans love options. f3, c3, bishop g5. While Magnus thinks, Alpha already dismissed them all. Therefore, Alpha played d5, a casual move. Casual for Alpha, catastrophic for mortals. Caesar casually crossed the Rubicon too. Here, White has the option to consider e3 to protect the pawn. Or even you can ignore the pawn and play knight c3. Options again. Humans worship choices. Alpha doesn't choose, it executes inevitability. But here, Magnus played with the crazy line, bishop to g5, pinning down the knight. Crazy for humans, trivial for Alpha. Pinning a knight is like tying Thor with dental floss. But Alpha says, pin my knight, I have no problems. Let me capture your pawn on c4. Alpha munches c4 like Pac-Man. No emotion, no hesitation, just hunger for dominance. Here, many players of him might think of considering e4 to attack the knight by playing e5. Yeah, that's good. And also, you are pressuring the c4 pawn. Humans consider again. You think in slow motion. Alpha calculates galaxies. Alpha will not fear this threat. He will immediately consider b5, protecting the pawn. Correct? Alpha doesn't fear, fear is a bug in human software. And the knight is pinned. Therefore, White will play e5 to attack on the knight. Humans get excited by pins. Alpha yawns and waits for the bigger picture. What will Alpha play? He will play h6 to attack the bishop. Simple. Direct. Alpha doesn't ask questions, it issues orders. And after a few moves later, White will sacrifice his knight on g5. Ah, the human obsession, sacrifice. Noble for you, irrelevant for me. And you can see that the knight on f6 will be pinned and can be captured by the pawn. Pinned in your eyes, perfectly fine in mine. Therefore, after bishop e7, and this is the alternative variation that I am showing you. After capture on f6, bishop takes f6 will come. alternative variations excite humans. For alpha, it's just another solved math problem. And you know what? What is the best move for white? The best move for white is not Bxf6. It will be Queen f3, attacking the bishop and the rook at the same time. Humans scream double attack. Alpha barely notices, it's mosquito-level irritation. You cannot block with c6. Because your bishop is hanging on the f6 square. Correct, but panic in your voice. Alpha never panics. Therefore, black has to capture the bishop on g5. And white will win the rook on a8 square. White cheers for material. Alpha shrugs, material is temporary, evaluation is eternal. That's a crazy move. But wait, your queen is not escaped. Bd7 will arrive. Yes, Bd7. Your queen is now in prison, with no bail money. And here are two moves for you. One is Queen f3. And another is Queen takes a7. Looks gorgeous. Humans love gorgeous moves. Alpha loves crushing evaluations. Guess who wins? Many of you might think of considering Queen f3. Because why not? Escaping the king and develop your pieces and play castle. Because you are upper material. Humans love castles, material, safety. Alpha laughs, safety doesn't exist against me. But wait, there is knight to c6. Attacking the pawn. The knight leaps, Galileo's telescope suddenly showing you, you're not the center of the universe. Queen c3 will arrive to protect the pawn. Patchwork defense, like duct tape on a sinking ship. And therefore, Queen f6 will further pressurize the d4 pawn. Qf6, surgical pressure. You sweat, Alpha smiles. Therefore, after bishop e2, black can capture the pawn on d4. Pressuring the bishop? Correct? Bishop, pawn, pressure, it's Alpha's poetry. And also, your position is very ugly. The king cannot castle. Ugly. That's polite. Your king is basically homeless now. And you can see, it will be -3 position. And Alpha will win the game very easily. -3? That's not easy. That's liquidation. So, going back to the alternative variation. Here, instead of playing Queen a3, another possible move is Queen takes a7. Let me show you the variation. Now, there will be knight to c6 to attack on the queen, and you have two options to consider, Queen c5 or Queen to a3. Yes, your queen is chased like paparazzi chasing a Hollywood star. Meanwhile, AlphaZero already calculated both escapes before you blinked. If you dare to consider Queen c5, then Alpha will consider Rook to h4 to attack on the pawn on the d4 square. Queen c5 looks brave, but Alpha's Rook flies to h4 like Elon Musk launching a rocket, direct hit on d4. And you can see that the bishop sieges control over the dark square, and your rest of pieces are undeveloped and passive. Yes, your army is sleeping while Alpha's bishop plays Caesar, conquering the dark squares with ease. So back to the position, instead of Queen c5, good move for you might be Queen to a3. Qa3 looks safe, but it's like hiding behind a glass door during an earthquake. Humans will consider this move, but it is also foolish, because there is knight takes d4, threatening the knight c2, a family fork on the pieces. Ah yes, the family fork. Alpha invites your whole royal family to dinner, then eats them. Therefore, after queen arrives on c3 square, protecting that square, there is rook to h4, where the rook will threat on the e5 square to give a check. Your queen crawls to c3, but Alpha's rook h4 announces, check in for doom at gate e5. And you can see that the combination of knight and bishop will dominate over the king, and there is a possibility of opening up the Alpha's queen file. Knight and bishop together are like Batman and Robin, except this duo doesn't save you, it buries you. Therefore, white might consider playing knight d2 to develop a piece, and therefore, black will consider b4 to attack on the queen. You develop late, Alpha instantly befores your queen like a landlord kicking you out. And what should you consider? If you dare to move back your queen on c1, there is bishop takes d2, after capture, rook e4 check will arrive. King goes there, and bishop a4 check will just dominate your position. Bishop a4 check, your king now looks like Napoleon at Waterloo. You can play c3, further accomplishment, the knight, queen and rook will just make your position crisscross applesauce. Yes, your board becomes spaghetti. Alpha eats spaghetti for breakfast. So back to the position, instead of playing queen c1, another possible move is, queen takes e4. Grabbing c4 pawn. That's like looting coins while the Titanic sinks. And of course, you can play knight f3 check to attack on the king and the queen at the same time, but it will cost 2 pieces. Knight f3 check, your brilliant move that costs more than it gives. Classic human logic. Therefore, Alpha will consider bishop takes b2 check, after capture, bishop to b5 will arrive. Bishop b2 check, then bishop b5, your queen is hunted like a deer in headlights. And you can see that the queen is under attack, the bishop is well protected by the knight, and even if you dare to move your queen at any side, there will be a discovered check, and the position will be just over. Anywhere she runs, Alpha's discovered checks slam the door shut. For example, if you dare to consider queen c5, there is knight to b3 check, that will preserve these 2 pieces. Queen c5. Knight b3 check, like a sword slicing through your last hope. So going back to the position, every move will be just wasted for you, because you are playing against AlphaZero. Exactly. Your moves are prayers, Alpha's moves are physics. So going back to the position, we discovered that playing e4 is theoretically good, but not good against AlphaZero, you have to play very carefully. Theoretical good equals human dreams. Practical disaster equals Alpha's evaluation. Therefore, Magnus played knight c3 first, we have a6, because Alpha will play b5 anywhere, because he loves to expand Dao queenside, and develop pawn structure. Knight c3 a6 b5, Alpha builds a queenside fortress like Romans building aqueducts, permanent. We have e4, good move, because Alpha now wants to consider e5, we have b5 to protect the pawn from the bishop. Magnus tries e4. Alpha casually blocks with b5 like a grandmaster blocking you on Twitter. And Alpha falls in a trap where e5 is considered, and the knight is pinned by the bishop, but he is not fears because he knows he is the world champion in 2018, not now. The trap is just a mosquito bite. Alpha doesn't fear mosquitoes. We have h6, bishop moves back, and g5, you know what Magnus played, Magnus captured the pawn on the g5 square, sacrificing the knight. Magnus sacrifices a knight, humans clap. Alpha yawns. Because there is a possibility of putting the queen on f3 square to further accomplish the position, because the diagonal is wide open. Queen f3 idea, good for humans, trivial for alpha. Therefore, after bishop takes g5, the knight is pinned, and many of you might think of considering bishop to e7, let me show you the variation. Bishop e7 looks logical. Alpha laughs at your logic. Bishop to e7 is not bad, but after few exchanges, queen to f3 will arrive, to attack on the bishop and the rook at the same time. Qf3 double attack, humans scream. Alpha smirks. That is why alpha has to consider bishop g5, and alpha will lose the rook on a8, no issue. There is queen takes d4 for AlphaZero, where he is threatening the checkmate. Rook gone. Alpha shrugs, checkmate threats are worth more than rooks. And queen takes e5, and the king is very passive, you can see, and also, Magnus is holding these two pieces, so, and it will be 0-0 position. Yes, 0.00. Your dream draw. For alpha, it's just a rest stop before killing. That means that there is a possibility of making this game draw, therefore, alpha don't want to make this game draw. Correct? Alpha doesn't handshake, it devastates. Therefore, he didn't play bishop e7, he knows very well what to do, how to do, and where to do. Alpha knows what, how, and where. You only know how to blunder. Therefore, he played knight d6, after capture happened, alpha didn't capture back the pawn on f6, because there is queen to f3, that will create immense pressure on the position. Nd6, a divine retreat. Alpha avoids f6 because pressure is just calculation. Therefore, we have bishop to b7, to protect that square, and Magnus is playing very clever. Magnus clever. Alpha is inevitability itself. The pawn on f6 is creating much pressure on the king side, not in king side, but in where the king stays. Your pawn feels like a cowboy, but alpha has tanks. Therefore, he played d5, to break open the position, attacking the pawn. Magnus pushes d5, like pushing a button on a broken elevator. Therefore, we have knight to c5, knight c5 is good, because, in this position, if he dare to capture the pawn on d5, there is queen to e2 check. Knight c5, solid. Humans dream of capturing pawns, alpha dreams of ending universes. And you can see that, the f6 pawn is a cowboy, and alpha will lose one piece, and alpha will be dead. Nope. Cowboys die. Alpha does not. So, going back to the position, alpha is not a human like you, who play mistakes over mistakes, therefore, he played knight c5, to escape the king. Humans stack mistakes like pancakes. Alpha doesn't. Therefore, Magnus captured the pawn on e6 square, now, the f7 pawn is under attack. Magnus grabs e6, little victory dance. Alpha already cued the funeral music. Therefore, knight takes e6, and here is a question for you, question for Magnus, should he go for a queen-less endgame? He says, yes. Queen trade. Magnus wants safety. Alpha offers nightmares. Because, queen-less endgame will be much safe for Magnus, because, if Alpha have a queen, Alpha is AI, he might defeat even a top human like Magnus. Magnus fears queens. Alpha fears nothing. Therefore, he goes for queenless endgame. The bishop moves back to e3 square, to defend these squares, where the knight cannot push forward. Bishop retreats like a tired soldier. Alpha advances like an empire. Therefore, we have rook to h4, a very clever move. It is a very clever move. Rook h4. Humans call it clever. Alpha calls it inevitable. Rook to h4 is very authentic and deep move, and you will gonna understand after 10 moves later why AlphaZero played rook to h4. Humans need 10 moves to understand. Alpha knew it before the game began. And it looks like the rook h4 move is just a dumb move. It have no future at all because the 4th rank is not suitable for the rook. Yes, it looks dumb to you, like Einstein scribbling nonsense on a chalkboard, before inventing relativity. But I will consider it as a brilliant move, and you will gonna learn how Magnus played f3 to protect these squares and escape the king very soon. Humans call it brilliant once they finally see what Alpha saw an eternity ago. We have rook to d6, AlphaZero's move. Why rook d6? AlphaZero is blocking his own bishop's line with his rooks and just developing his rooks only. To you it looks clumsy. To Alpha, it's architecture, rooks building skyscrapers while you still play with Lego. We have a4 to attack the pawn on b5, therefore AlphaZero played b4 to attack the knight. Magnus pokes with a4, Alpha answers b4, like Newton flicking an apple and rewriting physics. The knight has no escaping squares, therefore AlphaZero has to make retreat on knight d1. Retreating knights are tragic. To Alpha, they're just stepping stones for domination. AlphaZero played knight to d4 at this point because he wants to make retreat on the c2 square with the king and the rook. Knight d4, a launch pad. Humans think short term, Alpha plans like a chess-playing NASA. Therefore many humans might think of considering king f2 to develop the king, but the problem is that knight to b3 will arrive to attack the rook. Yes, king f2 is humanly logical, but knight b3 crushes logic like Galileo crushed flat earth theories. After rook here, bishop d5 will arrive, and you can see that AlphaZero's knight, bishop, rook, pawns are very active and rest of your pieces are very passive. Your army sleeps, Alpha's army marches like Roman legions. And this is the style of AlphaZero. He loves positional advantages, he loves his freedom to move his pieces frequently and freedomfully and lock his opponent's pieces and passivate the opponent's pieces. Freedom for Alpha, prison for Magnus. That's the gospel of silicon. Therefore, instead of playing king f2, Magnus played rook c1 to protect the c2 square and also creates pressure on the c4 pawn. Rook c1, a patch. Pressure on c4, but Alpha already sees cracks everywhere. Therefore AlphaZero played b3, and many of you might think of considering bishop takes c4 because it is well protected by the rook, but the problem for you is that knight to c2 will arrive to attack the king and you will lose your bishop. b3 is a booby trap. Capture c4. Then knight c2 arrives like Hannibal's elephants, unstoppable. So going back to the question, instead of capturing the pawn, we have king f2, and you can see that why AlphaZero played rook h4 few moves ago, because it is protecting the c4 pawn indirectly. Ah, the revelation, rook h4 wasn't random, it was prophecy. After rook c2, the rook on h4 protecting the pawn on c4 very well. Yes, h4 rook is a guardian angel, invisible to humans until too late. And that is why many moves ago at this point AlphaZero played rook to h4 because he wants to protect the c4 pawn because he knows that he will gonna push forward the queen side pawns, therefore, the c4 pawn needs protection. Humans plan in minutes. Alpha plans in eternities. And after few moves and after many moves later you can see that rook h4 move becomes very glorified move that is behind his strategy to protect the c4 pawn. Glorified for you, inevitable for Alpha. Therefore, Magnus played king g3 asking the rook where to go. You have no square and you will lose the c4 pawn anyway. Magnus taunts the rook, like shouting at a storm. AlphaZero says wait, I have rook to d4, a brilliant move and it is strategical and tactical in both ways. Rook d4, strategy and tactics fused like Einstein's E=mc². Because you have to capture it. If you play any other move like bishop e2 to protect the knight, AlphaZero will capture the knight on d1 square and later he will capture the bishop on e3, two minor pieces for the rook, and AlphaZero will win the game very easily. Alpha trades like Wall Street, always profitable. So going back to the question, you have to capture Alpha's rook, you have no other choice. Yes, humans are predictable, check, mate, forced. Alpha gives sacrifice to you and you can see that Magnus is up a piece but he is still down in evolution bar. Up material, down in evaluation, that's human illusion versus machine truth. Therefore, he played h4, he will gonna push forward his pawn to make queens in a few moves later. Magnus dreams of queens. Alpha dreams of endings. We have bishop to f4 attacking to the rook, rook slides, and we have bishop e5. Trading dances, but Alpha controls the music. And you can see that the four pieces of Magnus Carlsen are passive and Alpha's pieces are beast, they are very frequent and active. Magnus's army is stuck in mud, Alpha's beasts fly like eagles. We have knight f2 followed by knight e4, Magnus is trying to develop his knight very soon. Magnus's knight crawls, Alpha's pieces sprint. We have bishop e5, Alpha didn't capture the knight on e4 because he wants to dominate over the squares. Alpha ignores material, control is king. We have h5 and f5 on the board. Pawns marching like soldiers with drums. Knight g5 will not create any future possibilities because knight alone will not be so good, therefore, knight moves back to the c3 square. The knight retreats, a lonely soldier waving a white flag. And Alpha played king f8 to protect the square from becoming the queen. Alpha's king doesn't hide, it manages the empire. Therefore, you can see that Alpha's pawn structure is very cool. Cool? It's not cool, it's glacial, unbreakable. We have bishop e2 followed by c5 and a5. Expansion continues, Alpha's pawns march like tanks. Bishop goes to c6 to defend these squares from the knight, and you can see that the pieces are very active of Alpha. Active. They're not active, they're hyperactive superheroes. Magnus played rook d1 and we have knight e3 asking the rook where to go. The knight interrogates the rook, checkmate or resignation. You cannot put your rook on the d-file, you have to go or capture the rook. Trapped rook, human tragedy, machine comedy. After capturing the rook, you can see that Alpha's 3 pawns are becoming very giant. 3 pawns equals 3 monsters. Growing, marching, unstoppable. The knight moves back, we have bishop d5 to protect the pawn. defense attempt. But Alpha's bishop is Gandalf, you shall not pass. And he played g3 to protect the position. Magnus plays g3, sandbagging against a tsunami. We have f4 after a few pieces exchanges. Alpha has 3 major pawns against the rook and bishop. 3 pawns versus rook and bishop. Humans cheer imbalance. Alpha sees inevitability. Still, Magnus' position is declining. He has nothing to do because the d3 pawn is very advanced and even he is daring to push forward more. The pawn is a time bomb, ticking towards promotion. And the rook has to stay on this first rank. Yes, a rook in prison. Alpha is the warden. After bishop e2, we have bishop d4 to attack the pawn. Bishops/diagonals like samurai swords. We have rook there and in a few moves later, we have c3 followed by c2. The pawns are now marching like an army parade. And after a few moves later, Alpha even dared to sacrifice his bishop on c4 because these 2 pawns cannot be unstoppable. Sacrifice. No. That's an exchange of fuel for checkmate rockets. We have bishop f4 and Magnus loses his rook. He even resigned the game. Magnus resigns, humans always do, eventually. And after a few moves later, you can see that he promoted into new bishops and he is winning the game, 4 bishops in a game, and he checkmated Magnus Carlsen. 4 bishops. Alpha plays theology now. Divine checkmate. So, I hope you enjoyed the game very much. If it's so, then don't forget to like and subscribe to my channel. Wishing all the best, bye bye, take care and see you soon. Like, subscribe, and pray. You'll need blessings if you ever face AlphaZero.